I've carried this story for 43 years now, and there ain't a day that passes I don't think about those boots. They sit on my mantle still, leather cracked and faded, but somehow they feel heavier than the day we pulled them from under that red sandstone. My name is Samuel Hawthorne, and I was 24 when my younger brother Jacob vanished into Serpent's Canyon. He was 19, full of dreams and restless energy, the kind of boy who'd chase thunder across the desert just to feel alive. The year was 1881, and we were working our father's cattle ranch just outside Flagstaff. Jacob had always been the adventurous one, the one who'd climb the highest mesa or ride the wildest horse. I was the steady one, the responsible one, the one who stayed close to home and minded the cattle. But Jacob, he had this hunger for something more, something beyond the horizon. He'd spend hours staring out at the desert canyons, talking about the silver mines and the stories of lost treasure that drifted through town like tumbleweeds. The morning he disappeared was no different from any other. The sun was just breaking over the eastern ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Jacob was already up, saddling his horse and checking his saddlebags. He said he was going to explore the southern canyons, maybe do some hunting. I should have gone with him. God knows I should have gone with him. But I had cattle to tend and fences to mend, and I figured Jacob could take care of himself. I watched him ride out that morning, sitting tall in his saddle, his hat tilted just so against the sun. His boots were new then, dark leather with silver buckles he'd saved up for months to buy. He was proud of those boots, said they made him feel like a real cowboy. The last thing I saw was him disappearing into the mouth of Serpent's Canyon, his horse's hooves kicking up little clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air. When he didn't come back that night, I wasn't worried. Jacob had camped out before, and he knew the desert better than most. But when the second day passed with no sign of him, fear started creeping into my chest like a cold wind. By the third day, I was gathering a search party. We combed those canyons for 2 weeks, following every trail, checking every cave and crevice. We found his horse wandering near the river, still saddled but skittish. We found his hat caught on a juniper bush. But Jacob himself, he was gone like smoke in the wind. The desert had swallowed him whole, and for 12 long years I lived with the not knowing. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I heard his voice calling my name. I'd see riders in the distance and think maybe, just maybe, it was Jacob coming home. But the years passed, and the hope faded, and I learned to live with the hollow ache in my chest. I married, had children, built a life, but there was always this empty space where my brother should have been. Then came that day in 1893 when everything changed. A young geologist named Thompson was surveying the canyon for the railroad company. He was looking for the best route to lay track through the desert, mapping every outcrop and wash. He'd been working in the deeper parts of Serpent's Canyon, places where the walls rose so high they blocked out the sun. He told me later he almost missed it, that little gap beneath the red sandstone overhang. Thompson was a methodical man, the kind who documented everything he found. He said he saw something dark tucked back under the rock, something that didn't belong in the natural landscape. When he crawled in to investigate, his hands closed around worn leather and metal buckles. He knew right away they were boots, old boots that had been sitting there for years. He carefully extracted them, noting their position, their condition, the way they'd been protected from the elements by the rock overhang. When Thompson brought those boots to town, word spread fast. My heart stopped when I saw them. I knew those silver buckles, knew the way the leather had been oiled and cared for. These were Jacob's boots, the ones he'd been so proud of, the ones he'd worn the day he rode out of our lives forever. My hands shook as I held them, feeling their weight, their reality. After 12 years of questions and sleepless nights, I finally had something tangible, something real. But finding the boots only raised more questions. How had they ended up under that rock? Why were they there, hidden away like a secret? And most importantly, where was Jacob? The boots were empty, carefully placed, as if someone had removed them deliberately. There were no bones nearby, no sign of struggle or violence, just those boots, sitting in the darkness like a message from the past. The discovery shattered the careful peace I'd built around my brother's disappearance. All those years of telling myself he was probably dead, of learning to live with the loss, came crashing down. The boots meant Jacob had been in that canyon, had been in trouble, had maybe even survived longer than we'd thought. They meant I needed to go back, needed to search again, needed to follow this new thread wherever it might lead. I knew I couldn't let it rest. Not now. Not with Jacob's boots sitting on my kitchen table, staring at me like an accusation. I had to know what happened to my brother, had to understand why his boots were hidden under that rock. I had to finish what we started 12 years ago when we first rode into Serpent's Canyon, looking for the boy who never came home. The weight of those boots was nothing compared to the weight of the questions they carried. And I knew, sitting there in my kitchen, with the desert wind rattling the windows, that I was about to embark on a journey that would either bring me peace or destroy what little peace I had left. Thompson had marked the exact location on his survey maps, and he offered to guide me back to the spot. I accepted, knowing I needed someone who understood the canyon's geography, someone who could help me search methodically. We planned to leave at first light, to spend as much time as necessary combing every inch of that area. I had the feeling that the boots were just the beginning, that there were more secrets hidden in Serpent's Canyon, waiting to be discovered. That night, I sat up late, holding Jacob's boots in my hands, trying to imagine what had happened to him. The leather was still supple despite the years, protected by the dry desert air and the rock overhang. The silver buckles were tarnished but intact. These boots had been removed carefully, placed deliberately, not torn off in some desperate struggle. That gave me hope, but it also deepened the mystery. The next morning, I met Thompson at the general store, just as the sun was painting the eastern sky pale yellow. He was a thin man with careful eyes and steady hands, the kind of person who noticed details others missed. He carried his surveying equipment in a leather satchel, along with enough supplies for several days in the canyon. I brought my own gear, including rope, lanterns, and enough food and water to last a week if necessary. We rode out in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The desert was waking up around us, lizards skittering across the red rocks, birds calling from the sagebrush. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of juniper and the promise of heat to come. As we approached Serpent's Canyon, I felt my chest tighten with memories of that first search 12 years ago. The canyon mouth looked the same as I remembered, a narrow gap between towering red walls that seemed to swallow sound and light. We dismounted and secured our horses, then began the descent into the canyon on foot. Thompson led the way, consulting his maps and compass, guiding us along the same route he'd taken when he found the boots. The walls rose around us, striped with layers of ancient stone, each one representing millions of years of desert history. As we walked deeper into the canyon, I found myself remembering Jacob's fascination with these places. He'd always been drawn to the mystery of the desert, the way it could hide secrets in its folds and crevices. He'd talk about the ancient peoples who'd lived here, the petroglyphs they'd left on the canyon walls, the stories carved in stone. I wondered if he'd been thinking about those stories the day he disappeared. The canyon twisted and turned, branching off into smaller passages and hidden alcoves. Thompson explained that this was what made his survey work so challenging. The canyon was like a maze, with dozens of side passages that could lead to dead ends or open up into vast hidden chambers. A person could easily get lost in here, could wander for days without finding their way out. But Jacob had known these canyons, had explored them since he was a boy. He wouldn't have gotten lost. After an hour of walking, Thompson stopped at a bend in the canyon where the walls opened up into a small amphitheater. The red sandstone rose in smooth curves around us, creating a natural shelter from the wind. He pointed to a spot along the eastern wall where a large boulder had broken away from the cliff face, creating an overhang. Beneath it, almost hidden in shadow, was a gap just large enough for a person to crawl through. This was where he'd found Jacob's boots. I approached the spot slowly, my heart pounding. The gap was about 3 feet wide and maybe 2 feet high, formed by the way the fallen boulder had come to rest against the canyon wall. It would have been easy to miss, just another shadow in the red stone. But Thompson had been thorough in his survey, checking every anomaly, every variation in the rock face. I knelt down and peered into the gap. It was dark inside, but I could see that it opened up into a larger space. The air that drifted out was cool and dry, carrying a faint mineral scent. Thompson handed me a lantern, and I lit it with trembling hands. The flame danced in the still air, throwing wild shadows on the canyon walls. I took a deep breath and crawled into the gap, following the path my brother's boots had taken 12 years ago. The space inside was larger than I'd expected, a natural chamber carved by water over countless centuries. The walls were smooth and curved, creating a sense of being inside a giant stone bubble. The floor was covered with fine sand that had drifted in over the years, unmarked except for Thompson's earlier footprints. But there, in the exact spot where he'd found the boots, was a slight depression in the sand, as if something heavy had rested there for a long time. I held the lantern high, searching every corner of the chamber. The light revealed nothing but empty stone and drifting sand. No bones, no clothes, no sign of struggle or violence, just that depression in the sand and the memory of Jacob's boots sitting there in the darkness. I called his name softly, knowing it was foolish but unable to stop myself. The sound echoed back from the stone walls, hollow and alone. Thompson crawled in behind me, his own lantern adding to the light. Together, we began a systematic search of the chamber, looking for any clue that might explain what had happened to Jacob. We sifted through the sand with our hands, feeling for anything that might have been buried or hidden. The work was slow and careful, but I was determined not to miss anything that might bring me closer to my brother. After an hour of searching, Thompson called my name. He was kneeling near the back wall of the chamber, holding his lantern close to the stone. I crawled over to where he was working and saw what had caught his attention. There, scratched into the soft sandstone, were marks that looked like they might have been made by a human hand. They were faint, barely visible in the lantern light, but they were definitely there. The marks were crude, like someone had used a knife or sharp stone to carve them. They formed rough letters, though they were hard to read in the poor light. I traced them with my finger, feeling the slight grooves in the stone. Slowly, words began to emerge from the scratches. It was a message, carved by someone who had sheltered in this chamber, someone who had wanted to leave a record of their presence. The message was short, just a few words scratched into the stone with desperate urgency. As I read it, my blood ran cold. The words were in Jacob's handwriting. I was sure of it. I'd seen him practice his letters countless times, knew the way he formed his A's and B's. This was his message, carved into the stone during his final days in the canyon. But what the message said changed everything I thought I knew about my brother's disappearance. I sat back on my heels, staring at the carved words in disbelief. Thompson leaned closer, trying to read the message for himself. The implications were staggering, challenging everything I'd believed about what happened to Jacob in Serpent's Canyon. If this message was real, if Jacob had really carved these words, then his disappearance wasn't what any of us had thought. It was something else entirely, something that would require me to reconsider everything I knew about my brother. The words carved into the stone were simple, but devastating. They found me, going north, J.H. Sept 1881. I traced each letter with my finger, feeling the rough grooves Jacob had cut into the sandstone. The date matched exactly with when he'd disappeared. The initials were his, But the message itself opened up a whole new set of questions that made my head spin. Who had found him? And why would Jacob leave his boots behind if he was going north? I studied the message again, looking for any other clues. The carving was shallow but deliberate, made with something sharp. Jacob had always carried a folding knife, a gift from our father. The letters were uneven, as if carved in haste or desperation, but they were clear enough to read, clear enough to understand that Jacob had been alive when he made them. Thompson was examining the chamber more carefully now, his surveyor's eye catching details I might have missed. He pointed out that the sand near the back wall was disturbed differently than the rest, as if someone had been digging or hiding something. We began to excavate carefully, using our hands and knives to move the sand grain by grain. The work was tedious, but I was driven by the hope that we might find something else Jacob had left behind. After an hour of digging, my fingers struck something hard buried in the sand. My heart jumped as I brushed away the loose material, revealing a small leather pouch. It was Jacob's tobacco pouch, the one he'd always carried in his shirt pocket. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were more items: a small pencil stub, a folded piece of paper, and a few coins. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper, revealing more of Jacob's handwriting. This was a longer message, written in pencil on what looked like a page torn from a notebook. The writing was cramped and hurried, but I could make out most of the words. Jacob had written about being followed, about men who had been tracking him through the canyon. He'd hidden in this chamber for 3 days, waiting for them to pass, but they hadn't passed. They'd found his horse, found his trail, and eventually found him. The paper told a story I'd never imagined. Jacob hadn't been killed by wild animals or lost in the desert. He'd been taken by men who had been hunting him, men who had followed him into Serpent's Canyon for reasons I couldn't understand. The message said they'd offered him a choice: come with them willingly, or they'd burn down our ranch with our family inside. Jacob had chosen to go, to protect us from whatever threat these men represented. I read the message 3 times, each reading making the reality more clear and more terrible. My brother had sacrificed himself to save our family, had walked away from everything he loved to protect us from danger we didn't even know existed. He'd left his boots behind as a message, a clue that someone might find someday. He'd carved his last known location into the stone, hoping that if anyone ever found this place, they'd understand what had happened. But who were these men? And why had they wanted Jacob? The message didn't say, but it hinted at something Jacob had discovered, something that had made him a target. I remembered his fascination with the stories of lost treasure, his interest in the old mining claims scattered throughout the desert. Had he found something? Had he stumbled onto something that made him dangerous to someone? Thompson was reading over my shoulder, his face grave. He'd spent months surveying these canyons for the railroad, and he'd heard stories from the older prospectors and miners. There were rumors of silver deposits that had never been officially claimed, of men who disappeared after making big strikes. The desert was full of secrets, and some of them were worth killing for. We searched the chamber for another hour, but found nothing else. Jacob had been careful to hide his few possessions, but he'd left just enough to tell his story. The boots, the carved message, the hidden pouch, they were breadcrumbs leading to the truth. But the trail was 12 years old, and the men who had taken Jacob were long gone. Still, I had to try to follow it. I had to know what happened to my brother after he left this chamber. The message mentioned going north, which meant they'd taken him deeper into the canyon system. There were dozens of passages leading north from this chamber, each one branching and twisting through the red rock. Some led to dead ends, others to hidden valleys where a person could disappear forever. If Jacob had been taken north, it would be like finding a needle in a haystack to track him now, but I had to try. I folded Jacob's message carefully and put it in my pocket, along with the tobacco pouch and its contents. These were the only physical proof I had of what had really happened to my brother. They were precious beyond measure, fragments of his final days that connected me to him across the years. I promised myself I wouldn't give up until I'd followed every lead, explored every possibility. Thompson suggested we head back to town to resupply and plan our next move. The canyon system was vast, and we'd need more men and equipment to search it properly. We could organize a proper expedition, bring in experienced trackers and mountain men who knew the desert. But I knew that time was my enemy. 12 years had already passed. Every day we delayed was another day the trail grew colder. As we prepared to leave the chamber, I took one last look around. This was where Jacob had spent his final free days, hiding from men who meant him harm, making the terrible choice to go with them to protect his family. The chamber felt sacred now, a shrine to his sacrifice. I knew I'd never be able to think of this place without remembering what he'd done for us. We crawled back through the gap into the main canyon, blinking in the bright sunlight. The desert looked different now, less peaceful, more dangerous. Somewhere in this maze of stone and sand, my brother had been taken by men who'd threatened our family. Somewhere out there, he'd made his final choice. I had to find out where that choice had led him. Back in town, I spent the next 3 days organizing the largest search party Flagstaff had ever seen. Word of Jacob's message had spread, and men came forward offering to help. Some were motivated by curiosity, others by the promise of payment. But many were simply good people who understood that a family deserved to know what happened to their own. We gathered supplies, horses, and equipment for an extended expedition into the northern reaches of Serpent's Canyon. Thompson proved invaluable in planning our route. His survey maps showed every major passage and landmark in the canyon system. He identified 3 main routes leading north from the chamber where we'd found Jacob's boots, each one branching into smaller passages that could take us deeper into the desert. We decided to split into 3 groups, each taking a different route, maintaining contact with signal mirrors and arranged meeting points. I chose to lead the group taking the westernmost route, a narrow passage that wound between towering walls of red stone. My team included 2 experienced trackers, a prospector named Martinez, who'd spent 20 years in these canyons, and Thompson himself. We carried enough supplies for a week, including rope, lanterns, and tools for digging and excavation. Each man understood we were looking for signs of passage 12 years old, traces that might have survived the desert's harsh conditions. The passage was challenging from the start, requiring us to navigate narrow ledges and steep descents. The walls pressed close on either side, creating a sense of being buried alive in red stone, but Martinez proved his worth immediately, pointing out subtle signs that others might have missed. Here, a scratch on the stone that could have been made by a boot heel. There, a depression in the sand that suggested someone had rested. The traces were faint, but they were there. After 2 days of careful searching, we found something more substantial. Hidden beneath an overhang, protected from wind and rain, were the remains of a small campfire. The ashes were old, mixed with sand and debris, but Martinez was convinced they were from the right time period. Near the fire ring, we found a few scattered bones, rabbit most likely, that suggested someone had camped here and cooked their food. The discovery encouraged us to search more thoroughly. We spread out across the small alcove, sifting through sand and debris. Thompson found a small piece of metal, tarnished but recognizable as a belt buckle. It wasn't Jacob's, his had been different, but it suggested that someone had been here, someone who might have been traveling with him. The buckle was crude, hand-forged, the kind that miners and prospectors often made for themselves. Martinez studied the buckle carefully, turning it over in his weathered hands. He'd seen similar work before, he said, made by a man named Cassidy who'd run a small mining operation in the northern canyons. Cassidy had disappeared about 10 years ago, his claims abandoned, his equipment left to rust in the desert. Martinez had always wondered what happened to him. Now he was beginning to suspect that Cassidy's disappearance might be connected to Jacob's. We continued north, following the passage as it twisted deeper into the canyon system. The walls grew higher and more oppressive, blocking out most of the sky. The air was cooler here, and sound carried strangely, echoing off the stone in ways that made ordinary noises seem threatening. I found myself listening for voices, for any sound that might indicate human presence, but heard only the whisper of wind through stone. On the third day, we reached a place where the passage opened into a wider valley, hidden deep in the heart of the canyon system. The valley was maybe a mile long and half a mile wide, surrounded by walls so high they seemed to touch the sky. A small stream ran through the center, fed by springs that emerged from the rock. It was a hidden paradise, a place where someone could disappear completely from the outside world, but the valley showed signs of human habitation. There were the remains of several crude shelters, built from stone and wood. The structures were old and partially collapsed, but they'd been substantial enough to provide long-term shelter. Near the stream, we found evidence of mining activity, piles of tailings, the remains of a sluice box, and several shaft openings that disappeared into the rock. Martinez was excited by the discovery. This was clearly a mining camp, probably established by men who'd found a rich vein of silver or gold. The equipment was old but sophisticated, suggesting that whoever had worked here had been serious about their mining. But the camp was abandoned, and had been for years. Whatever had happened here, it had ended badly for the miners. We searched the camp methodically, looking for any sign that Jacob had been here. In one of the collapsed shelters, Thompson found a piece of cloth that might have come from a shirt. It was faded and rotted, but the pattern was familiar. I thought I recognized it as similar to a shirt Jacob had worn, but after 12 years, I couldn't be certain. Still, it was another piece of evidence that we were on the right trail. Near the largest of the mining shafts, we found something that made my blood run cold. Carved into a wooden post that had supported the shaft entrance were initials and dates. Most were illegible, weathered by years of exposure. But one set of initials stood out clearly. J.H. 1881. Jacob had been here. He'd carved his mark into the wood, just as he'd carved his message into the stone chamber. But there were other initials too, and they told a darker story. R.C. 1881 was carved just below Jacob's mark, and below that, in different handwriting, was a message that chilled me to the bone. They found the silver, had to silence them. Sept. 1881. The handwriting was different from Jacob's, cruder and more hurried. It was signed with initials I didn't recognize. TWO. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together. Jacob and someone named R.C., probably the miner Cassidy, had discovered a rich silver vein in this hidden valley. But someone else had found out about their discovery, someone who'd been willing to kill to keep the secret. The message carved in the wood suggested that both Jacob and Cassidy had been silenced to protect the secret of the silver mine. I stood in that abandoned camp, surrounded by the ruins of dreams and the evidence of violence, and felt the weight of 12 years of questions finally beginning to lift. Jacob hadn't just disappeared. He'd been murdered, along with his partner, to keep them from revealing the location of a rich silver mine. The men who'd taken him from the stone chamber had brought him here to kill him, but not before forcing him to reveal everything he knew about the mine. The wooden post with its carved messages became the center of our investigation. We examined every mark, every initial, trying to piece together the story of what had happened in this hidden valley. Martinez recognized some of the initials from his years in the mining camps. ROC was almost certainly Robert Cassidy, the missing miner. TW was likely Thomas Walsh, a man with a reputation for violence who'd been known to claim other men's strikes as his own. We searched the camp more thoroughly, looking for any trace of Jacob or Cassidy. In the collapsed remains of what had been the largest shelter, we found bones. They were old, bleached white by the desert sun, but Martinez was convinced they were human. There were two sets, one larger than the other, buried in a shallow grave that had been disturbed by animals over the years. My hands shook as I helped uncover them, knowing that one set might belong to my brother. The bones told a story of violence. Several showed signs of trauma, breaks that could have been caused by clubs or axes. These men hadn't died naturally. They'd been killed brutally and buried hastily in the desert. The grave was shallow and poorly concealed, as if the killers had been in a hurry or hadn't cared about hiding their crime properly. After 12 years, the desert had done its work, scattering the evidence but not destroying it completely. We found personal effects buried with the bones, a belt buckle that Martinez identified as Cassidy's work, a small silver cross on a chain, and most heartbreaking of all, a pocket watch that I recognized immediately. It had been our father's, passed down to Jacob on his 18th birthday. The watch was tarnished but still intact. Its hands stopped at 11:47. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of time and loss, knowing that Jacob had carried it with him to the end. The watch confirmed what I'd feared, but needed to know. Jacob was dead, had been dead for 12 years, murdered in this hidden valley for the secret of a silver mine. The men who'd taken him had killed him and his partner, stolen their discovery, and left their bodies to rot in the desert. It was a common enough story in the mining camps, but knowing it was my brother's story made it personal in a way that cut deep into my soul. But the story wasn't finished. We still needed to understand what had happened to Thomas Walsh and the other men who'd committed these murders. The camp showed signs of having been worked for several years after the killings, with newer equipment and more recent mining activity. Someone had profited from Jacob's death, had taken his discovery and made it their own. The question was whether they were still alive, still working the mine, still benefiting from their crimes. Thompson's surveying equipment proved useful in mapping the mine workings. The main shaft went deep into the rock, with several side tunnels branching off from the main passage. The work was sophisticated, requiring knowledge of geology and mining techniques. Whoever had taken over the operation had been professionals, not casual claim jumpers. They'd invested time and money in developing the mine properly. We descended into the main shaft, our lanterns casting dancing shadows on the rock walls. The passage was well constructed, with timber supports and carefully carved steps. At the bottom, maybe 60 feet down, we found the main working area. The walls glittered with veins of silver ore, rich deposits that would have been worth a fortune in 1881. Jacob and Cassidy had made a real discovery, the kind that men killed for. The mine showed signs of recent activity. Tool marks on the walls were fresh, ore carts sat ready for use, and there were supplies stored in side chambers. The mine was still being worked, which meant that Walsh or his associates were still alive, still profiting from their murders. The realization filled me with cold anger. My brother's killers were still out there, still breathing, still benefiting from their crimes. Martinez examined the ore samples we collected, his experienced eye assessing their value. The silver content was high, he said, among the richest he'd ever seen. This mine could have made Jacob wealthy beyond his dreams. Instead, it had gotten him killed and buried in an unmarked grave in the desert. The irony was bitter, but it also gave me a sense of purpose. If the killers were still alive, they needed to face justice for what they'd done. We spent another day exploring the mine and the surrounding area, gathering evidence and trying to understand the full scope of the operation. The mine was extensive, with multiple shafts and a complex system of tunnels. It would have taken years to develop, and the investment would have been substantial. This wasn't a simple claim-jumping operation. It was a sophisticated mining enterprise built on murder and theft. As we prepared to leave the valley, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I wasn't going to let Jacob's killers escape justice. I would find Thomas Walsh and anyone else who'd been involved in my brother's death. I would bring them to trial, or I would bring them to justice in whatever way the desert allowed. My brother deserved that much, and my family deserved to know that his killers had been held accountable. The journey back to Flagstaff was somber. We carried Jacob's remains with us, along with the evidence we'd gathered. The pocket watch never left my hand during the ride. Its stopped hands a constant reminder of the moment when Jacob's life had ended. But we also carried hope. For the first time in 12 years, we knew what had happened. We had evidence. We had names. We had a chance at justice. Back in town, I arranged for Jacob's remains to be buried properly in the cemetery next to our parents. The funeral was small but heartfelt, attended by friends and family who'd never forgotten the boy who'd disappeared into the desert. I spoke about Jacob's love for adventure, his generous heart, his willingness to sacrifice himself for his family. But I also spoke about justice, about the need to hold his killers accountable for their crimes. The evidence we'd collected was substantial, but it was also 12 years old. The law in 1893 was different from the law in 1881, and the jurisdiction in the desert was complicated. Still, I was determined to pursue every legal avenue available. I hired a lawyer, filed reports with the territorial authorities, and began the long process of seeking justice through the courts. But I also began planning a more direct approach. The legal system moved slowly, but my investigation moved faster. I used the money from the sale of our family ranch to hire private detectives and trackers, men who knew the desert and its secrets. Within a month, we'd traced Thomas Walsh to a mining camp near Tombstone, where he'd been living under an assumed name. He'd grown wealthy over the years, using the silver from Jacob's mine to establish a legitimate mining business. But his past was about to catch up with him. The detective I'd hired was a former sheriff named Crawford, a man with a reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found. He'd tracked Walsh through a series of aliases and false identities, following the trail of silver and the records of mining claims. Walsh had been careful to cover his tracks, but not careful enough. The silver from Jacob's mine had a distinctive quality that Crawford had learned to recognize. Crawford's report painted a picture of a man who'd built his fortune on the graves of others. Walsh had been involved in at least 3 other suspicious disappearances in the mining camps, always managing to acquire the claims of men who'd vanished without a trace. He'd grown bold over the years, confident that the desert would keep his secrets. But the desert had betrayed him, giving up Jacob's bones and the evidence of his crimes. I traveled to Tombstone with Crawford, armed with warrants and evidence. The confrontation with Walsh was something I'd dreamed about for months, but the reality was different from my imagination. He was older than I'd expected, grey-haired and prosperous-looking, dressed like a successful businessman rather than a desert killer. When we arrested him, he seemed more annoyed than afraid, as if murder was just another business expense. Walsh's initial response was denial, but the evidence was overwhelming. The pocket watch, the carved messages, the testimony of Martinez and the other miners who'd known Cassidy, it all pointed to his guilt. Under pressure, he began to admit to parts of the story, trying to minimize his role and blame others who were conveniently dead. But the core facts remained unchanged. He'd killed Jacob and Cassidy for their silver mine. The trial was a sensation in Tombstone, drawing crowds from across the territory. The story of the missing ranch hand and the hidden silver mine captured the public imagination. I testified about finding Jacob's boots and the messages he'd left behind. Thompson described the scientific methods we'd used to locate the mine. Martinez provided expert testimony about the mining operation and the value of the silver ore. Walsh's defense was weak, relying mainly on the passage of time and the circumstantial nature of some of the evidence. But the jury was convinced by the weight of testimony and the physical evidence we'd presented. The pocket watch was particularly damaging, as I was able to provide detailed testimony about its history and Jacob's attachment to it. The carved messages in the stone and wood were harder to dismiss. During the trial, more details of Walsh's operation emerged. He'd been part of a gang that specialized in claim jumping and murder, taking over profitable mines by eliminating their rightful owners. Jacob and Cassidy had been just two victims in a string of crimes that stretched across the territory. The gang had operated for years, using violence and intimidation to build their mining empire. The testimony revealed that Jacob had discovered the silver vein by accident while exploring the canyon system. He'd told Cassidy about his find, and the two had begun working the claim in secret, hoping to establish their rights before anyone else learned about the deposit. But word had leaked out, probably through careless talk in one of the saloons. Walsh and his associates had learned about the discovery and decided to take it for themselves. The confrontation in the hidden valley had been brutal, but brief. Jacob and Cassidy had been outnumbered and outgunned, forced to reveal the location of their richest ore deposits before being murdered. Walsh's testimony, given under oath, was coldly matter-of-fact about the killings. He spoke of them as business transactions, necessary steps in acquiring valuable property. The jury was visibly disturbed by his callous attitude. The verdict was guilty on all counts, and the judge sentenced Walsh to hang. But even in victory, I felt hollow. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring Jacob back. It couldn't restore the 12 years of wandering and grief that our family had endured. It couldn't give me back the brother I'd lost or the conversations we'd never had. The satisfaction I'd expected was overshadowed by the finality of loss. Walsh was executed 3 months later, taking whatever other secrets he might have known to his grave. Some of his associates were never found, disappearing into the vast spaces of the Western Territories, but the immediate threat was ended, and the silver mine was returned to Jacob's estate. I inherited my brother's discovery, the fortune he'd died trying to protect, but it felt like blood money. I used some of the silver mine's profits to establish a fund for the families of missing miners, hoping to help others avoid the years of uncertainty we'd endured. The mine itself I sold to a legitimate mining company, unable to bear the thought of profiting directly from the place where Jacob had died, but I kept the pocket watch, the boots, and the messages he'd left behind. These were the real treasures, the proof that my brother had lived and loved and sacrificed himself for his family. The years after the trial were quieter, but not peaceful. I'd remarried and had children, but I carried Jacob's story with me wherever I went. I told my sons about their uncle, about his courage and his sacrifice, about the price of greed and the value of family loyalty. I wanted them to understand that heroism wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it was about making the hard choice to protect the people you loved. The silver mine continued to produce for several more years before playing out, its veins exhausted by intensive mining. The hidden valley returned to its natural state, the mining equipment removed, the shafts sealed for safety. But the place remained sacred to me, a monument to Jacob's memory and a reminder of the cost of justice. I visited occasionally, leaving flowers by the spot where we'd found his remains. As I grew older, I began to understand that finding Jacob's killer had been only part of the healing process. The real healing came from accepting that death was part of life, that loss was the price of love, that memory was the gift the dead left to the living. Jacob's boots on my mantle became less a symbol of loss and more a symbol of connection, a bridge between past and present that kept his spirit alive in our family. The story I've told you took place over 40 years ago, but I remember every detail as if it happened yesterday. The weight of those boots in my hands, the sound of Thompson's voice in the canyon, the sight of Jacob's carved message in the stone, these memories are as real to me now as they were then. They've become part of who I am, woven into the fabric of my life like silver threads in rough cloth. People sometimes ask me if I regret pursuing Walsh, if I think the revenge was worth the cost in time and money and emotional energy. The answer is complex, but I always tell them that I had no choice. Jacob was my brother, and he deserved justice. Our family deserved to know the truth. And sometimes, in a world where the strong prey on the weak, someone has to stand up and say that evil actions have consequences. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes, if you're persistent enough and brave enough, it gives them up. Jacob's boots were just the beginning of the story, the first clue in a puzzle that took years to solve. But solving it brought our family peace, brought Jacob home, and brought his killers to justice. In the end, that was worth everything it cost us. The years following Walsh's execution were marked by a strange mixture of closure and renewed grief. Having the truth didn't make losing Jacob easier. In some ways, it made it harder. Before, I could imagine that he'd somehow survived, that he was living somewhere under a different name, that he might someday walk back into our lives. Now I knew with certainty that he was gone, had been gone from the moment he rode into Serpent's Canyon that September morning in 1881. I found myself visiting his grave more often than I'd expected. The headstone was simple granite, carved with his name and dates and the words, "Beloved brother and son." Below that, I'd had them carve, "He gave his life for his family," because that's what he'd done. He'd chosen to go with Walsh's gang rather than see our ranch burned and our family threatened. In the end, that choice had cost him everything, but it had saved us. My wife, Sarah, was patient with my obsession but worried about its effect on our children. She'd known Jacob briefly before his disappearance, had liked his easy smile and gentle manner, but to her, he was a memory, a tragic story from my past. To me, he remained a living presence, a voice that spoke to me in quiet moments, a standard against which I measured my own choices and actions. The silver mine's profits allowed us to live comfortably, but I was careful not to let wealth change who we were. I remembered Jacob's values, his belief that money was just a tool and that character mattered more than possessions. I invested in the community, supporting schools and churches, helping families in need. It seemed like the kind of thing Jacob would have done if he'd lived to enjoy his discovery. Sometimes I wondered what Jacob's life would have been like if he'd survived. Would he have married, had children, become a successful miner or rancher? The questions were painful because they highlighted all the experiences he'd been denied, all the joys and sorrows he'd never known. But they also reminded me to appreciate my own life, to value each day and each relationship as the precious gifts they were. The physical evidence of Jacob's final days remained important to me. His boots sat on the mantel in a place of honor, polished and cared for as if he might return to claim them. The pocket watch I carried always, its stopped hands a reminder that time was precious and finite. The carved messages I'd had photographed and framed, displaying them in my study where I could see them when I worked or read. These artifacts became conversation pieces when visitors came to our home, leading to discussions about family loyalty, justice, and the cost of greed. I found that telling Jacob's story helped others understand their own losses, their own struggles with grief and anger. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming more than just our family's tragedy. It had become a parable about love and sacrifice in the harsh world of the frontier. As my own children grew older, they showed different reactions to their uncle's story. My eldest son was fascinated by the detective work, the careful gathering of evidence that had led to Walsh's conviction. My daughter was moved by Jacob's sacrifice, his willingness to die rather than see his family harmed. My youngest son was more practical, asking why Jacob hadn't just told the sheriff about the threats instead of going with the killers. These questions forced me to think more deeply about Jacob's choices and motivations. The frontier was a place where the law was often distant and ineffective, where men had to protect themselves and their families through their own strength and courage. Jacob had made the choice he thought would keep us safe, even though it cost him his life. In the context of the time and place, it was probably the right choice, even if it led to tragedy. The passage of time brought new perspectives on old events. I began to see Walsh not just as a monster, but as a product of his environment, a man twisted by greed and violence into something inhuman. The frontier created opportunities for both heroism and villainy, and the same harsh conditions that had shaped Jacob's character had warped Walsh's. Understanding this didn't excuse Walsh's crimes, but it helped me understand how such things could happen. I also came to appreciate the role that chance had played in the whole story. If Thompson hadn't been surveying that particular section of canyon, Jacob's boots might never have been found. If we hadn't persisted in our search, the truth might have remained buried forever. If Walsh hadn't grown careless over the years, he might have escaped justice entirely. The resolution we'd achieved was partly due to our efforts, but partly due to luck and timing. The community around Flagstaff had changed dramatically in the decades since Jacob's disappearance. The railroad had brought new people and new opportunities, transforming the rough frontier town into a more civilized place. But the desert remained the same, vast and unforgiving, still capable of swallowing up those who ventured into it, unprepared. Jacob's story served as a reminder that the wilderness demanded respect and caution. I began writing down the full story of Jacob's disappearance and our search for the truth, hoping to preserve it for future generations. The written account was more detailed than my spoken versions, including facts and observations that might be important to historians or other researchers. I wanted there to be a complete record so that Jacob's sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten or distorted over time. The act of writing forced me to relive many painful memories, but it also helped me understand the broader meaning of what had happened. Jacob's story was part of the larger story of the American West, of men and women who'd ventured into unknown territory, seeking opportunity and freedom. Some had found what they were looking for. Others, like Jacob, had found death. But all had contributed to the building of something new and important. As I worked on the written account, I found myself thinking about the nature of heroism and sacrifice. Jacob wasn't a famous gunfighter or Indian scout. He wasn't a leader or explorer. He was just a young man who'd loved his family enough to die for them. But in many ways, that made his heroism more meaningful, more real. He'd faced an impossible choice and made the hard decision, the decision that put others before himself. Now, as I sit here in 1924, 43 years after Jacob rode into Serpent's Canyon, I find myself thinking about the weight of memory and the burden of truth. The boots on my mantle have become more than artifacts. They've become symbols of all the choices we make and the prices we pay for love and loyalty. Every time I look at them, I see not just leather and silver buckles, but the embodiment of a young man's courage and sacrifice. My grandchildren ask me to tell Jacob's story, and I see in their eyes the same fascination that drew Jacob to the desert canyons all those years ago. They want to hear about the search, the discovery, the trial and execution of Thomas Walsh, but they also want to understand why it matters, why their grandfather keeps an old pair of boots on the mantle and carries a broken pocket watch in his vest. These are harder questions to answer, but more important ones. I tell them that Jacob's story is really about the bonds that hold families together, the invisible threads of love and loyalty that connect us across time and distance. When Jacob chose to go with Walsh's gang, he was protecting something more valuable than silver or gold. He was protecting the people who mattered most to him, even though he knew the cost would be his own life. That kind of love, I tell them, is what makes us human. The silver mine played out years ago, its veins exhausted and its shafts abandoned. The hidden valley has returned to its natural state, home now to deer and rabbits rather than miners and their equipment. But the lessons Jacob taught us through his sacrifice continue to enrich our lives. His death wasn't meaningless, it was the foundation upon which our family's future was built. Without his sacrifice, none of us might be here today. I've lived long enough to see the frontier disappear, replaced by towns and cities, roads and automobiles. The wild country where Jacob died has been tamed, mapped, and settled. But the human qualities he embodied, courage, loyalty, selflessness, remain as relevant today as they were in 1881. In a world that often seems to value wealth and success above all else, Jacob's story reminds us that some things are more important than material gain. The written account of Jacob's story has been completed and copies deposited with the Historical Society and the Territorial Archives. I want his sacrifice to be remembered, not just by our family, but by future generations who might face similar challenges and choices. The frontier may be gone, but the need for courage and integrity remains constant. Jacob's example can inspire others to make the hard choices, to put others before themselves when the situation demands it. Sarah passed away last winter, and I find myself thinking more about reunion and what might await us beyond this life. I like to imagine that Jacob is waiting somewhere, still 19 years old, still wearing that easy smile I remember from our childhood. I think about the conversations we'll have, the years we'll catch up on, the explanations I'll finally be able to give him about how his sacrifice shaped our lives and our choices. My own children are grown now, with families and concerns of their own, but they carry Jacob's story with them, and they'll pass it on to their children in turn. The boots on the mantle will eventually pass to one of them. Along with the responsibility of keeping Jacob's memory alive, the pocket watch I'll be buried with, wanting to return it to Jacob if such things are possible in whatever comes after this life. Sometimes I walk out to the cemetery and stand by Jacob's grave, telling him about the changes in the world, the growth of our family, the successes and failures that have marked the passing years. I tell him about his nephews and nieces, about their children and their children's children. I want him to know that his sacrifice wasn't in vain, that the family he died to protect has flourished and grown and remembered his gift. The desert still calls to me occasionally, and I sometimes drive out to the edge of Serpent's Canyon, looking into its red depths and remembering that day when we found his boots under the rock. The place looks the same as it did 40 years ago, unchanged by time and weather. But I'm different. I'm an old man now, carrying the weight of years and memories, understanding things about loss and love that I couldn't have grasped as a young man searching for his missing brother. I've learned that finding the truth doesn't always bring the peace you expect. Sometimes it brings new kinds of pain, deeper understanding of loss, sharper awareness of what might have been. But truth is still worth seeking, still worth the cost in time and effort and emotional energy. Without truth, we can't properly grieve, can't properly heal, can't properly honor those we've lost. Jacob deserved truth, and finding it was the last gift I could give him. The boots sit on my mantle, silent witnesses to a story of love and loss, sacrifice and justice. They're just leather and metal now, empty of the feet that once wore them, but they carry a weight that goes far beyond their physical substance. They carry the weight of memory, of love, of a promise kept and a brother honored. They remind me every day that some bonds can't be broken by death, that some stories are too important to forget. When my time comes, as it soon must, I hope I'll have the courage Jacob showed in his final days. I hope I'll face the unknown with the same quiet strength he displayed when confronted with an impossible choice. I hope I'll be remembered not for my wealth or success, but for my loyalty to family and my dedication to truth and justice. These are the lessons Jacob taught me, carved in stone and leather, written in blood and silver, preserved in memory and love. And so the story ends where it began, with a pair of boots and the weight of memory. Jacob's boots, found under a rock in Serpent's Canyon, led us to the truth about his disappearance and death. They led us to justice for his killers and peace for our family. But most importantly, they led us to understanding about the power of love and the meaning of sacrifice. That understanding has shaped our lives and will continue to shape the lives of those who come after us. The boots remain on my mantle, and Jacob's story lives on in the hearts and minds of his family. His sacrifice was not in vain. His love was not forgotten. His courage continues to inspire. And somewhere in the red canyons of the desert, his spirit rests in peace, knowing that he kept faith with those he loved even unto death. That is the legacy of Jacob Hawthorne, written in leather and stone, preserved in memory and love, as eternal as the desert itself. If you like this type of story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel.